Well, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see so many people from all around the world, and it's really an enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm keen to get out of the way as quick as I can tonight, not to steal their time. Just briefly to say who we are and what the context of this event. Perspectiva recently celebrated its 7th birthday. We're a charity based in London, and we play with our elevator pitches, and they change over the years. But the essence of it is that we're interested in the relationship between 3 kinds of world. The inner world of the human being, the psyche, the soul, the spirit, is very important to us. We see it as something sort of culturally neglected, something we need to understand better. But we also want to have that in conversation with complex systems at scale, the economy, politics, technology, and so on. And we're interested in how all of this plays out in society in contexts like this, when we're trying to navigate together what's going on and make sense of the world. So our tagline is systems, souls, and society, as a way of covering the kinds of relationship we're trying to make sense of. And that's reflected in our public conversations like this one. But we're also a publisher, and although we won't announce all the details now, we do have some very good news about a significant ramping up of our publishing arm next year based on a grant that we earned this year just passed. So watch the space for further Perspectiva books to explore these themes in greater detail. And we also can announce that in June, we have the Realization Festival. Perspectiva are co-founders of that with St. Giles House. That's right at the end of June. And we have already confirmed the speaker, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And there are other things to share. We have a Perspectiva community you can find online. And we do have a Substack if you're interested in our writing, and we publish ourselves, but also bring in other people to share the space with us. So do check out Perspectiva Substack. And if you want to support us as a charity, not least at Christmas, do consider becoming a paid subscriber. That really helps a lot. So, well, Iain and Alastair are people I know personally, but let me just share who they are to the outside world. First of all, Iain is, I think, one of not many people who can reasonably be called polymath. And he has a background as a literary scholar, and not just, read a few books, but actually taught literature for 7 odd years, I believe. So a really deep grounding in the humanities. Subsequently became more interested in science for a period of time, and later became a neuropsychiatrist, to put it technically correct, I think. And that led to, over the years, to him realizing one big thing, one really big idea that I've jokingly called the McGilchrist maneuver, but it's based on the hemispheric hypothesis, an understanding of the different hemispheres of the brain, not so much what they do, but how they are, and what follows for how they attend to the world and the world that's brought into being as a result, and everything that follows from that. And we're very, very proud to publish his book, The Matter with Things. If you don't have it already, it's a mammoth 2-volume book, but very highly recommended. And I hope tonight's event at least doesn't discourage you from buying it, and hopefully, sends you on your way. Alastair is, well, I know him most recently as someone who took my sons fishing. And I share that with all candor because it gets to the heart of the man, I think. He wanted them, younger generation, he knew they were coming through Scotland. We were not so far away. He wanted to show them where the food came from, took them out on his boat. The delight in my sons was off the charts. And it's a sort of testament to Alastair's grounded spirituality, that he's very much interested in questions of meaning and purpose and the sacred, but at the same time extremely earthbound, giving a great deal of his time, energy, and attention and brilliant mind to significant issues of land reform and protecting those who can't always protect themselves, speaking up for those who are in poverty and fighting on their behalf. So an extraordinary mind and heart. And it's really an enormous pleasure to bring these two wonderful people together. And tonight, we are technically part of the series, Attention as a Moral Act, which this is now the 9th chapter of that. However, I've given complete permission, not that they needed it, to speak about whatever they wanted to. And I know that over the last few days, since we decided on this event quite last minute, only about a week ago, there's been some sending of books across Scotland on both parties, and they've both been studying each other's work. So I want to leave it to them to follow the conversation. The title is First Principles and Second Sight. and I'll leave it to them to decide where to go with that. And whoever feels most moved to speak first, you're welcome to do so. I will join you again in about an hour. Take care and look forward to listening. Over to you, Alastair and Iain.
Well, Alastair,
here we are.
Here we are at last, which is wonderful. And you've got I'm drinking the fine Talisker, but I think you're drinking a little-known whiskey called the Hera.
Goodness me! I mean, I wasn't sure if we're allowed to do this. My daughter, who is a clinical neuropsychologist, you might be interested to know.
Really?
She sent me a bottle of the Hera, which is the one that is newly produced in house. So I will have a small drop of this while we are talking.
Yes, let's not go wild.
To raise a toast to yourself.
And very much to you, Alastair. And to our Slanjava, and to our listeners too. Mm. So I warned you that I mean, I didn't make this title. I think Jonathan did. But it occurred to me as I was reading your work that it had something quite interesting to say about the Scottish mind, because in your book I found that you quoted, I can't remember the name of the man, Farrar, who said that there was a Caledonian Syzygy, which is a lovely word. Syzygy means a coincidence of opposites, and he could have got away with that, really. But there is something about the Scots that is puzzling. You know, my dad was a Scot, and he was a very down-to-earth sort of Scot. And he said the thing about the Scots is they're very hard-working, they're very precise, they're very down-to-earth, they make great engineers and doctors and so on. And yes, that's true in a way, but there's another completely different side to the Scots, isn't there? And that's the bit that encompasses second sight. So they do manage to do this split. And it occurred to me, perhaps you'd like to pick me up on this or not, but there's something here that reminds me of my feeling about the Germans, that they're both, you know, magnificently precise and make very good engineers, but they were really the first romantics.
Well, what a way to plunge in. If I might say, first of all, for people who don't know your book in double volumes, I mean, look at the thickness of that, nearly 1,600 pages, and that with things. You're deeply wrestling with that problem as a philosopher. I'm not coming at it as a philosopher. I'm coming at it more from a poetic perspective and a culturally rounded perspective, an experiential perspective. What you are doing in these 1,600 pages, which I should say I've only skimmed, I've only had it for a couple of days, I've just skimmed it. Most of your conclusions, and you're very badly behaved, because there are some chapters to which you gave no conclusion. I had to presume that they are inconclusive. Inconclusive. Inconcludable.
I only gave conclusions to the first part because it's science, and I wanted people who weren't comfortable with the science just to get the drift. Anyway,
yeah. What you're doing is you're putting so many strands together. You're coming at it from a psychiatric basis, which is fascinating. You're also going into the philosophy of time, into wave motion, physics, the whole shebang. And you're doing so in a way that gives a wonderful grounding in these disciplinary areas for people who haven't got it. So the person who came to mind as I was reading you was Clarence Glacken, Traces in the Rhodian Show. When I was a student at Aberdeen in our first year geography classes, that was one of the set books. And it's often been remarked that Glacken, who said that it was when the shipwrecked soldiers came ashore in Rhodes and they saw geometric patterns in the sand, knew that this must be a sign that there were human beings here, because who else could make geometric patterns on the sand? And it's often been said that Glacken was one of the last of the scholars who could really pull together an immense interdisciplinary perspective and bring it to bear on the matters of the world. And that, it seems to me, he wasn't the last, but you're doing that here. And I hugely congratulate you for so doing. But you asked me there about the Caledonian Syzygy. Antisyzygy. Syzygy. It's a philosophy's gift to Scrabble. And basically, this was an idea that Professor G. Gregory Smith came up with in his book, Scottish Literature, published in 1919, in which he said there are two moods in the Scottish psyche. On the one hand, as your father just said, there is the engineer, the mathematician, the accountant. On the other hand, there is this crazy world, as he puts it, where you are tossed in the horns of Elfland, the imaginal world. And I think in many respects, what he is describing there is what you describe when you speak of the left and right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, the mechanic, the engineer, the doctor, etc. The right hemisphere, the artist, the musician, the one who is away with the fairies.
You could see it that way. But of course, as you and I know, the fairies are not to be taken lightly. So that it's not a matter of being somehow scooped up into some unrealistic fantasy. I believe that there's something in the Scottish psyche, and I have, and you have, more than I have because you grew up here, but I know stories of and have had some experiences of people making unbelievably unlikely prophecies that turned out to be entirely true. They were able to see things here. And my partner is of Scottish descent, and she has her head screwed on. Don't think otherwise. But she has the most amazing capacity for second sight, which she takes very much in her stride. But it is something that is very real, I think, and we only don't recognize it because if you stop believing in something and stop attending to it, you don't see it anymore. The faculty for seeing it withers, and you can't do it anymore.
And we need to ask, why is this important? Because here we are, we've got 500 odd people on here just now, and we're diving straight into the fairies and the second sight, which most philosophers would not take credibly. Most philosophers would think we are off the wall in this. And why are we taking it so importantly? That we're talking about first principles and second sight. We're talking here about epistemology. In the warm-up here, I said to you that right beside me here, I didn't have planned this, it's just on the shelf. I have the Institute of Metaphysics by the Professor of Moral Philosophy at St. Andrews University. He was writing this in, when was it, 1875, and Ferrier invented the word epistemology, which is about the theory of what knowledge is and how knowledge is structured. How do we know what we think we know? What is the meaning that gives meaning to meaning? Is there any sense in what we say? These kind of questions. And we're diving straight into second sight here. You're speaking to me from Talisker House in Skye. I have here, this was planned, a book recently published in Skye by Steve Taylor, The Seer, Visions, Dreams and Prophecy, Isle of Skye and the Hebrides. Now, I know two of the now deceased seers, or I knew two of them in here. Two of them were good friends of mine, Norman MacLeod of Bridge House in Harris, and Torquil McRae of Grimshadow, the next village to me in the Isle of Lewis. So I've sat with these people and had first-hand accounts of their seership. Why does this matter? Because if we are concerned with first principles, what is real? What is reality? Anomalous phenomena, like these telepathic, clairvoyant type precognitive phenomena, are of huge importance. And they may not appear to many of the people listening to us just now because of how they might be situated culturally. But as you've already indicated, Iain, if you are living in an indigenous culture, such as those of the Hebrides, then you cannot not be aware of it.
No.
You cannot not be aware. And so you've got to factor this. You can either deny your own culture and indeed deny, as you've just indicated, deny your own reality, or, well, then you're in a state of denial. We're talking about very real issues. When I was 18, I had failed my first year of physics at Aberdeen University. I had to resit it. I was sitting there swatting in my father's, surgery, because the doctor's house and the surgery were united then. So I was sitting in our surgery house at Glenmore in North Loch St. Louis. And my father was ill. He was away in Regmore. He was in hospital there. And my mother had driven off in the car to go to Stornoway, 7 miles away. She went there nearly every day. This was not unusual. And she was going to go and fly over to Inverness and visit him in Regmore. And about 10 minutes after she'd left, there's me sitting studying my physics texts. And I look up only to see my father's beloved whippet dog, Sheba, who he had rescued from abuse, jump up out of the ditch, run across the road and smack into a passing van and killed outright. I ran out. I told the driver I'd seen it. There was nothing he could do, just to drive on. And I did what any rural child would have done in that age. I went to the byre, the cow's shed. I got a Hessian sack and a spade, placed Sheba's limp body into it, and walked out to the moor to dig a hole and start burying her. And I would say, although that I was 18, I psychologically regressed. I needed my mother to be there so that she could tell my father, because this was 1976, summer of 1974, the summer of 1974. I needed my mother to be there so that she could pass the news, because she couldn't just pick up a mobile phone and tell my dad in a hospital in those days. And I'd no sooner got the hole dug when my mother's car reappeared at high speed over the brow of the hill. I ran towards it. She screeched to a halt. She got out, looking white as a ghost, and shouted at me, "What's the matter?" I said, "The dog's dead." She said, "Thank goodness, I thought it might have been a child." She thought it might have been me or my sister. She doubled back, managed to catch the plane to Inverness, got into Regmore, said to my dad in his hospital bed, "Iain, I've got bad news for you." "I know," he said, "it's Sheba, isn't it?" "How did you know?" she said. He said, "Because all last night I kept on being woken up by Sheba jumping up on my bed and pawing me." Now, Iain, when I tell that story in Lewis, or if you told that story in Skye, people would tell you another couple of stories just like it, quite likely something they'd experienced themselves. And this is where what you writing about time, you culminating with that, what is it, 114 pages or something chapter on the sacred, is so important. Because you're opening the ground for these things.
Well, I see them as separate, really, but connected, if you know what I mean. I have very little experience of paranormal phenomena directly, but I am quite clear that there is a realm of the sacred, and it is that perhaps this, in some ways, bridges in many people's lives. I mean, I sometimes say when Aboriginal people in Australia say that they can hear the voices of ancestors, that they can see things happening hundreds of miles away, which turn out to be true, who are we to say that they can't do these things? And again, I think it's atrophy of a faculty which we have taught ourselves not to use. Richard Dawkins, a man of whom you've no doubt heard, has a dogma that children wouldn't normally think in terms of anything to do with the sacred or the religious, or particularly the paranormal. Except it was drummed into them by our culture. But the reality, which is, I quote the scientific evidence for this, is that children, when they're little, automatically do think in these terms. And they only stop doing when they go to school and find that it's no longer considered smart to talk like that. So I think that's interesting. And a couple of other things occur to me. One is that you, in sending our initial exchange of emails, you won't mind my mentioning that you said that Johnson and Boswell, when they were up here, sort of mocked this. And I didn't remember that at all. In fact, I thought it was rather the opposite, that they had exactly the cast of mind that a proper scientific person should have, which is open, there may be something here, and they would be interested in hearing more, but they weren't sure, and they certainly weren't dismissive. And they were very impressed by the stories that they heard. One story that I can tell, but then perhaps we can move on from second sight to more to do with the more general sense of the sacred, is, well, there are some things that are a bit too personal to mention, but they're absolutely riveting. But one is from my partner, who was at the opera in London, I think with her husband, and saw a friend that she knew who was in France, who was there, and said, "What are you doing here?" And I don't remember the rest of the conversation. But the next day, she got news from France that he had died. And I mean, she's not, my partner, given to seeing things, as it were, or, I mean, she's a very, very rational, down-to-earth person. And I find that people who have this faculty don't make a big thing out of it. They take it along with their rationality. And I wish we were able to have this balanced way, this syzygy of these two things, which complement one another. I remember in also reading something I just want to mention that you told in part of your book about, I think you had a bus of 18 archaeologists and engineers you brought from Glasgow, Edinburgh, I forget where, and you were in the Trossachs, I think. I may have got this wrong. And there was a big question with a lass about going out at a certain time, because this was the fairies' time, the twilight, the gloaming. And you went to a shean, which is a kind of holy place for where you see fairies. And you were there in your sleeping bag, and you looked out and you saw, well, you should perhaps tell it, but you saw this disk of lights that was close to the ground and was coming down the path. It was moving along the path as though it were sort of walking almost, and came to you and went back into the shean. So I thought that was, let me say, at least very interesting and not to be just dismissed.
Well, I've had 2 or 3 experiences like that, which I've written about at various points. You're talking about my book, Poacher's Pilgrimage, which is the book where I really go into the nature of the spiritual and the spiritual embodied in the land. And what interests me about these experiences,
talk about that.
What interests me about it is that this opens us up to the nature of imagination. And the question that I address in Poacher's Pilgrimage, do we merely have imaginations, or are we moving in imagination? Are we moving in cosmic imagination? And this is where you're writing, where you open a pathway to profound interconnectedness in your analysis of time, and how it interacts with how you see the right hemisphere of the brain is very relevant.
Yes.
Why does this matter? It matters because it's about our relationality together. It raises the question whether we are parts of one another.
Yes, and when you have time to read my book, if you ever have time to read my book at greater length, you'll see that one of my grounding, in fact, probably the central message, is that everything exists in relation, that relations are prior to the things that are related, which is why there was a problem with things, because things are secondary to the relations that they exist in, the network that they exist in. So I very much agree with that. And I think the important point about imagination is one that you make using I think a now customary distinction between the imaginary and the imaginal. And but I would say that there is nothing fantastic about the imagination. Wordsworth and Coleridge, 2 very important figures for me intellectually, made the big distinction between fantasy and imagination. And fantasy takes you away from reality, but imagination takes you into the depth of reality so that you really see it.
Yep.
And I think what you're seeing and what you're describing in Lewis is that meaning of the word imagination. Not a fantasy world, but a world more real than the one we imagined is the only real one.
And I'm thinking here of, I recently read Henri Corbin's work, Alone with the Alone. So he was a great French Islamist, and he's writing about the scholar Ibn Arabi. And he has this wonderful line that prayer is the supreme act of the creative imagination. So,
yes, I love that.
Creative, and he capitalizes creative imagination. That we pray to God or pray for God, God prays for us, all in a oneness. But before we dig into that further, can I ask you the question that fascinates me? Because I was, I spent a number of hours with your book, skimming it, as I say, but I kept on wondering, Iain, what is motivating you here? Because, I mean, you've reached the top of your career in conventional neuropsychiatric terms and so on. You're clearly well positioned as a philosopher, and yet the longest chapter in your book, over 100 pages, ends up being on the sacred, which is risky ground. What is motivating you? What experiences have you had that opens you to the importance of this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I can describe experiences, but really, I think what motivates me is something rather unusual and probably prejudicial to a career, which is the truth. I mean, it sounds grand to say that, but I think the thing that we have most importantly lost in our lives is any sense of truth. We now believe and say the most absurd things that have ever been said by moderately intelligent human beings. We have lost track of truth. Even in science, we're now being constrained by all kinds of things. You can't say this, you mustn't do that. We are losing truth. And I wanted to be truthful to the reality I was trying to get at. This is my life's work, this book. And I was begged by philosophers who read my book not to write a chapter on the sacred, because he said the philosophy in these books is very interesting and it can be taken seriously. But if you write about the sacred, nobody will take you seriously. And yet, in many ways, what I'm writing about leads rationally to, I wanted to take people who couldn't countenance any idea of the sacred or the divine, perfectly reasonable position for many people nowadays, take them by the hand and show them things that are scientific and that are reasonable, and bring them by stages to a place where they could accept it or see it. And one of the things I feel very much about this kind of neck of the woods is something I can't put my finger on, to do with the sacred. Whether or not one sees it as specifically to do with a religion or not is another matter. But in the very natural world here, which called to me to come and live here, is something very, very special. People who come here say there is something, there is a numen, there is a feeling, there is, I don't know what they call it, but there's a sort of something that speaks. And I think that, and you can't deny that, I think, unless you willfully blot it out. And I often ask myself the question, perhaps you can reflect a bit on this. Why did those Celtic saints have to come so far to find peace and solitude? After all, in those days, it was before EasyJet. You didn't have to go too far from Londinium, a few miles, to find total peace and seclusion. So what drove them through wildness, through adverse climate, through taking their precious books on little coracles across the water, pushing on and on towards the outer rim of the known world? What were they doing?
Well, St. Adamnan, in his biography of St. Columba, written a century after Columba's death, round about 697, I think it was, he testifies to that. He testifies to people coming from far and wide to go out in small boats and find little skerries, little rocks in the sea, where they could sit and be alone with God and nature and pray for the world. And
Yes.
you said about coming to Talisker where you are just now, and I would imagine it's probably a glass of Talisker whiskey that you've got with you, or if not, you'll certainly have it in your cupboard.
What else could it be?
I actually did a naughty little bit of homework here, because I dug out a poem by the Isle of Rassay poet, Samuel MacLean.
Oh, he's wonderful.
I mean, talk of our deep ecology. I dug out one of Sawley's poems called Iain, Beaches. It's from his poems for Emma, who is the wife of Cuchulainn, his mythical muse, his figure of love. And I just need to explain some place meanings here. Talisker meaning the sloping rock. And the north coming into the Gaelic there.
Which I sometimes speak about.
Clash, the Stony Point.
That's it. I know the bit you're going to read. It's so wonderful.
The bit of the reddish rock. So you've got these. The picture being painted here is of the sloping rock, and then down on the sea, these two rocks, and beside them there's the white sea churning in. Now listen to this. You know what I'm going to read, but the folk listening to us don't.
Wonderful lines, but only read the first stanza because we haven't got time for the whole poem.
Don't worry, it's only a short bit. And Prishal, is that how you pronounce it? Prishal, a rock that looks like an animal here. If we were in Talisker on the shore, where the great white mouth opens between two hard jaws, Ruan and Clash, and the Bida Rua, I would stand beside the sea, renewing love in my spirit, while the ocean was filling Talisker Bay forever. I would stand there on the bareness of the shore until Prishal bowed his stallion head. Until the rocks are worn away. That is the place where you are living. That is the integration of people, poetry, and nature.
It's mind-blowingly beautiful. I mean, the poem. We mustn't give the impression that places, otherwise the place will be overrun with tourists, which we could never do. But, but you know, the other thing that I think is very relevant is that haunting line with which he begins a poem about Rassay, about Halig, where I've been, the ruined village there. And it begins, time the deer is in the wood of Halig. Wood of Halig. And the interesting thing is I hadn't really picked up until reading you, actually, that the word deer and wild are one and the same.
Fia meaning both the wild and the wildness and the deer. And the deer, you know, here I am, I'm sitting underneath the fairy on the Christmas tree. I'm sitting at the foot of the Sheehan, the fairy tale, as I talk to you, metaphorically speaking. And the deer is the cattle of the fairies. And, you know, Dr. John McIntosh, there's Michael Newton's book of him. Oh, too high up. You know, in his essay on the supernatural in the Gaelic world, he says that fairy is a metaphor for the imagination. So, in other words, fairy is an indigenous way of talking about what you call right hemisphere.
Well, it's being open to whatever is, listening and being honoring of whatever comes to you, not constantly saying, but I know better, it's like this, I already know this, I'm going to put it in my box of knowledge. And it's getting away from that is in our world so difficult. It's getting back to all that is meant by Jung's unconscious mind, in which sort of powerful symbols, and the thing about them is that once they're made explicit, they lose their power. So it's a deeply implicit, unexplicit knowledge, and that is why it will always seem lacking or fantastic to somebody who's determined to dismiss it. And as Johnson himself said, for those who want to be skeptical, there are many reasons, and he lists them, but he also beautifully says, but there are other reasons for standing back from that position as well. He was so wonderfully unpredictable man. He was, in fact, in some ways, the first romantic, the first appreciator of Shakespeare, and he was also a rational thinker, a very down-to-earth man. He managed to bridge these worlds we're talking about. And I'm honored that he came and stayed in my house. And there's not many people
I know,
who
2 nights in your house.
He did. And he slept in what was then called the low bedroom, which is now my library. And as I say, not many people can say that Dr. Johnson slept in the library.
So you put me right on that, because I had picked up that Johnson was a bit incredulous. And what he says basically is that some people are incredulous about it. But as you rightly corrected me, he himself was very open to what he was saying there, and to his reflection on Martin, who wrote about 40 pages on the second side. Can we take this to a slightly different level? Because one of the feelings that I had reading or skimming your book, Iain, is that it was as if there was a gradually sloping swimming pool going into unfathomably deep water at the deep end. And you are taking your reader in each of your chapters by the hand and leading them round to the deep end and saying, this is actually real.
This is where you swim.
This is where you swim. This is where you learn to dive. This is where you even perhaps learn to breathe underwater. Is that?
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that's exactly what I hoped. So I'm delighted, thrilled that you feel that. But I feel that you're taking people to the same place, just by a different means, a more narrative and more poetic means. I mean, after all, one of the things that is so central to your work, I mean, the title "Soil and Soul" itself tells us, is this link. Two links, really. One is between the earth and whatever is above and beyond it, and the other is to the sense of the place, the importance of place. And that's something we've been taught no longer to feel, an allegiance to a place. It's not fashionable, it doesn't fit with the post-industrialized society where we were all uprooted and taken away from our culture and thrown into a hugger-mugger world in a city where we had to reinvent meaning, because those meanings had been left behind deep in the places that we came from. And you know, one of the things that staggered me when I was writing The Master and His Emissary was to discover that animals such as rats bond as much with their nest as they do with their mother. So their nest is like their mother. I mean, that's pretty important. And your work unveils this, what's there in this landscape. I found myself, and you mentioned this concept, which I hadn't heard of. I'll get the pronunciation probably wrong. Is it kianalas?
Kianalas, yes, a deep yearning, a kind of homesickness for place, a yearning, a longing for your place of belonging.
And you know, all the cultures that have not been uprooted and deracinated and thrown around the world have this feeling. And it's not just a useless yearning, it's a sense of connection, a longing, which literally means a stretching out of yourself from some place that you wish to be close to again. C.S. Lewis writes very well about this.
Well, you know from Soil and Soul that my best known work is land reform, and my involvement in the 1990s was the organization that brought egg in. I mean, you will look out your window. Can you see egg from where you are?
No, it's from the other end of the island, but I can.
You've probably got Rum, but the mountains of Rum just blocking.
You can see Rum. You can see Rum if you're up on the heights.
Just behind.
I know.
Rum.
Yes.
And so to me, I suppose, having grown up in the Isle of Lewis and having experienced real life communities of place, and then as a young man, when I was 22, being sent by voluntary service overseas to Papua New Guinea and finding exactly the same cultural understanding of community in Papua New Guinea as we had in Lewis, to the extent it helped me understand my own home place properly for the first time. You know, you don't, the fish doesn't see the water till it steps into a different water. That experience opened me to this work with people and place, which I think is germane to our modern environmental predicament. that we have
Yes.
become deracinated, or as Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, puts it,
Yes.
disembedded from the place
That's
of
it.
our embeddedness. And so
Yes,
one
yes.
of the practical applications of the kind of work I'm doing and that you're doing is the ways in which it can help to re-embed us.
We need to be re-embedded. We need seriously to be re-embedded in place and in time. These are the two things that are most important in where we are in this world. And I don't mean that they should confine us, but in fact, they liberate us into this other world that we're talking about. It's through them that we find the greater, the eternal, the whatever. We don't do it by turning our backs on place and time, but by inhabiting them. And it's the continuity of time, i.e. those who came before us and those who will come after us, and the continuity of place that have been disrupted for us and have made us, I don't know what to say, pilgrims, wanderers, people who are fleeing from their own being.
The fairy on top of my tree hands me down just the very book, and here is Plato's Timaeus. And there is
Yes.
a wonderful line early on in the Timaeus where Socrates, I think it is, defines time as being a moving image of eternity.
Yes.
A moving image of eternity.
Yes.
And when I first read that at the age of early 20s, it kind of blew my mind, because it is so much the sense of time that you get in Hebridean religious people. We're talking here of Free Church of Scotland,
Yes.
those sort of people that are the indigenous people of the communities. Earlier, I mentioned the retired policeman, now passed away, Norman MacLeod of Bridge House of Harris, and he wrote, I put it on my single page of notes for tonight, so I could quote him exactly, but I've got him quoted in Poacher's Pilgrimage, where I discuss my meeting with him, in which he's describing to me the vision, the second sight vision he had of events in the Falkland War several weeks before they happened. And eventually he was so afflicted with the second sight that he prayed to God to have it taken away from him.
Yes.
And as Steve Taylor, in this book that I mentioned here, who's got a whole chapter on Norman, says, and indeed, as Norman's own daughter told me when she came to a talk I gave in Benbecula a few years ago, that was successful. He was then relieved of the predicament of seeing what was going to happen to people before it happened. But Norman said
that's
to me,
interesting. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting? Isn't it? Because Norman said to me, he was criticizing a book by Ludovic Kennedy, in which Kennedy
yes. No, I read that bit. Yes. But carry on. Yes.
And Kennedy was poo-hooing the idea of God.
Yes.
And this is what Norman said to me. He said, "My God, Alastair, is a high and lofty one who inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy." Now there you have Hebridean metaphysical religion, who inhabiteth eternity.
I mean, it's all there, really, in that. And this sense of, these things that are double-edged slightly, the high and mighty, the awe-inspiring, and the thing that can also inspire melancholy, or kianlas, or however you pronounce it, kianalas.
Kianalas, you got it right. Yeah.
That seems absolutely core to the feeling one has here of contacting something very profound, and without the sort of tinge of the melancholy or whatever, there wouldn't be the depth of it. And I'm wondering if you and I both, it turns out, as I discover, as far as I can tell anyway from my brief reading of you, that we both embrace panentheism, not pantheism. And the important, you pointed out in what you had to say about that, I have things to say about it in my work, but you pointed out that in some ways that perhaps explains how so much that seems to our eyes to be painful, destructive, whatever, is also taken up into the realm that has meaning, that has ultimate meaning. And I think that is a way I would very much embrace with you. Yeah.
I mean, this is why Hebridean people, for those who don't know, the Hebrides are islands like Skye, where Iain is speaking from, and the Isle of Lewis, where I grew up and have my primary connections with. Hebridean people have really experienced hardship in the past. They've had, in an extreme environment, terrible losses in the First and Second World War because they were such competent mariners and practical people. Incredible.
Sorry about that, Iain. It looks like we've just lost Alastair. He might be trying to come back on in. I might ask Jonathan if he wants to step in. And
yes. Well, yes. I was hoping to talk about some other things with the.
Don't worry, he'll be back. I'm sure.
He'll be back.
Yeah. I'll play temporary substitute. I was struck there for a second. I know this is not literally what Alastair said, but it sounded awfully like for a minute he was saying the right hemisphere is a fairy. But I want just for a second there was, were you really saying that?
No.
What I was I know that's
I'm not saying that.
I know you're not saying that, and I think everyone listening knows you're not saying that. Just I guess we keep an eye out for him entering the room up there.
Yes, of course.
What I was curious to understand Iain better was what not everyone watching may know, and even Alastair, because he hasn't had so much time with the books yet, may not know. In the second volume of The Matter with Things, although the sacred comes right at the end, it doesn't come out from nowhere. There is a sort of cumulative argument that includes rethinking many metaphysical principles from the nature of time, the perception of value, sort of cosmological purpose, the nature of meaning, the role of and so on. Can you talk us through just a little bit what that story is, how you end up at the sacred? And a lot of people want to go straight there, but I feel in some ways even more interesting is how you bridge the scientific premise to fill that out towards the sacred.
I suppose it offers two things. One is it shows that it's not disconnected from, but actually consequent on. Hello, Alastair. And understand. I'll just finish answering Jonathan's question. But consequence on a reimagining that which we must make in any case of what we think our reality to be. And I suppose the other thing is that it offers a way of bringing people who might not be entirely close to the possibility of the divine, but don't as yet experience it, to coming to a place where they can find something that resonates. So that's really it. Yes.
I will take my leave again momentarily, but just to say that part of the book, the first phase of the second volume, for me is my favorite part. Just for those who are watching who are interested, I can disappear for a second to let them carry on for another 10 minutes or so.
Alastair, I wanted to ask you, unless you have something pressing, but I wanted to use the bit of time we've got left to talk about wildness. I don't know if you like the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, but he wrote wonderfully about wildness and wilderness and how important it is to us. And I don't think we understand this. We think that as long as there is land, it's okay, but it being wild, untamed, undominated by the human spirit is very, very important. And there's almost nowhere left in these islands where this is true. There are bits of Skye and bits of the Outer Hebrides. And you probably know something that really I think is so awful that everybody watching this should write to their MPs or raise it in public, is that a Danish company who have bought parts of Skye are going to erect enormous wind farms on Skye, dethroning the last really great place of wildness in this part of the world, or one of them anyway. And this is a crime. It's not something that any human being should be contemplating. If it costs more to put them in the sea, then do so. Or it might even mean that we become less dependent on electricity altogether. But to destroy the beauty of these wild places is an unforgivable sin, in my view. I feel very strongly about it, you can probably tell.
Well, I am of. Am I back on? Can I just say that what cut me off there is that although I had my phone supposedly switched off, so somebody was able to get through, ironically, who is from the Isle of Harris, one of the men in the Galgale Trust, a local organisation here in Govan that we're involved with, who wrestles profoundly with alcohol, with ill health. A wonderful man. A wonderful man who can burst into Gaelic song at a moment's notice. So that was the Isle of Harris. They must have known we had the Harris whiskey.
It was on the second site.
So
the second site. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I hope it doesn't come on again and throw me off, because
can I engage your considerable prestige, imagination, and energy in helping us fend off this disaster? Or perhaps it's too late, but it is really
okay. So basically, my view is that terrestrial wind farms, as distinct from ones far out to sea, should only be where the local community decides that it wants to have them under its control for its benefit. Like you have the Point and Sandwich Trust in the Isle of Lewis, putting £1 million a year into the community, whereas if it was a commercial one, it would only get £45,000 a year. Or something like that. So that is my position on wind farms. The situation we're caught in just now is that the urban world is saying, well, we need to get carbon-free energy, so we'll go to places like the Highlands and Islands. We're not going to have it from nuclear, so we'll go to places like the Highlands and Islands, and we'll wire it down from there. And the problem I have with that, Iain, is that if you destroy the beauty of nature, which in my view this is doing, it is turning a natural landscape into a mechanical landscape. If you destroy the beauty of nature on that scale, because some of those Skye turbines will be standing 2/3 of the height of the Cullen, the highest mountains in Skye, from the platform level that they'll be on. If you destroy that, you start to destroy people's capacity to appreciate beauty and to care about anything that really matters in this world.
And destroy their access to awe and wonder, and thus erode their imagination and destroy part of their vitality. It is a really, really serious thing. It's as serious as it gets, in my view. So there we are. I just want to say that because so much of what you write about and what you alerted me to is this importance in the folklore here of the wild, how they too, it's often said, oh, only kind of educated, romantic people like you see this. But actually the ordinary people of Skye and of these places also see that wildness as crucial.
But let me put a caveat in here, because a lot of my work this year has been engaged with Community Land Scotland. You'll find 2 of my papers if you go onto their website. And the whole rewilding thing, where, again, wealthy people, what we call the green lairds, are buying up vast areas of Scotland to rewild them so that they can sell the carbon and maybe later on the biodiversity uplift credits on it. And the problem that we have with this is that it is taking control of place out of the hands of local communities by permanently tying it up for a purpose that the laird who has parachuted in determines.
I'm sure you know that I wouldn't be speaking for that, and life is complicated, and one has to. Well, that's a quite different issue, frankly, from the one I'm talking about, which is the deliberate destruction and violation of the few places of natural wildness and beauty that we have left. I mean, I think that is appalling. And so I'm not talking here about the rewilding by green landlords from elsewhere, but there are many sides to most questions, but some are so clear that we really ought to be, we ought to be doing something to defend our world.
Well, I think we have to have, the what I would call ecological restoration alongside repeopling. Many of these places were cleared of their people historically.
Exactly.
Young people cannot buy places to live in a place like Skye.
I know.
Because the second homers and what have you price them out of the market. How do you pull that together? At the deepest level, you pull it together by reactivating imaginative potential. I've been working this past month on an essay for Dark Mountain Journal, which I have titled A Sermon to the English on Land Reform. And it's set out in the structure of a traditional Scottish sermon. It'll be out in Dark Mountain Journal, I think probably around Easter time. And it's basically suggesting to the English what they need to do to achieve what we're doing in Scotland, was now about 3% of our land and community land trusts and 500 community land trusts. But that comes from the artists and musicians. It comes from the poets. It comes from the songwriters. It comes from the visual artists who inspire a vision, your right hemisphere stuff, inspire a vision of what the future can be, so that we remember what has been dismembered, we revision how the future could be, and then we do the political and practical left hemisphere work of reclaiming how to bring it into being. And we're in a perilous political time just now, because these massive amounts of money and the desperate imperative of action on climate change is powering up forces which, in my view, are recolonizing our land and should have no place in modern Scotland.
And you're so right that it is also important that this is to do with a cohesive community and a cohesive society. But I don't think that speculators from other countries coming in and the Chinese are behind the despoliation of many Greek islands. They've put money into it, and these unutterably beautiful and sacred landscapes are destroyed. Anyway, there we are. I'm not arguing here that we don't need green energy. We do, but we have to do it in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I'm here to usher in the next phase of the evening, to bring in the feeding the 5,000, but it's going to say feeding the 500, but it's not. It's about that. I want to ask a couple of things, partly to give people time to write their questions, because of the numbers here. Choosing people from the audience is far from straightforward, so we'd much prefer if you could please write your question. The chat is now reopening, and I have colleagues who will be looking at those questions and choosing among them. It's not as simple as first come, first serve. We're trying to get a range of viewpoints, a range of kinds of people, and we're trying to kind of keep in mind what's been asked before. So if we don't pick your question, please don't take offense. It's not personal. I'm really glad with where you ended up, in a way. I know it was a bit tense, but it's sort of interesting because I began introducing Perspectiva in terms of systems, souls, and society, and you kind of got there at the end, because you begin with second sight and premonitions and possibly the paranormal and the sacred, but you come around to a real live political issue in a beautiful place with contested values and competing economic logics and so on. And for me, this is really, in some ways, where it's at. It's the challenge of how do you navigate these different things. So the question is, first of all, for Alastair, and I have a slightly different one for Iain, although you can both answer them both. Alastair, you invoke imagination, and I know Iain would be a big fan of imagination in general as well. But I wonder sometimes if people expect too much of imagination, if it's always assumed to be filled with goodness, because there's also dark imagination. There's also the imagination of those who long for world domination and so on. What is it in the nature of imagination that gives you hope, or rather, what forms of imagination need to be brought into being such that they're actually beneficent and positive and not destructive? Tell me more about what it is that gives you faith and imagination.
I think that, as Henri Corbin says in his book on Ibn Arabi, it must be grounded in the divine. Hebridean people take God very seriously. They take God as a matter of fact, a matter of experience. In Bernard Shaw's play, Joan of Arc, which is somewhere behind me, right?
Don't turn around to get it. No, we know it.
Where's my fairy god? There's my you see what a wonderful fairy I've got. Her inquisitor says to her, "How do you know that the voices of God that you hear are not just your imagination?" And Joan says, "But that is how God speaks to us." That is how God speaks to us. So on your question about dark imagination, I would say that if our work with imagination, if our work of art and of intellect is not grounded in the God space, if it is not grounded ultimately in prayer, we must be very careful Otherwise, as many native peoples will tell you, the gift or charism can very easily turn toxic and poison both its possessor and those around it. So I would say that if we are working with imagination, Jonathan, consider starting from a place of prayer. Consider starting from a place of offering yourself and your works to that which will serve what the Russian Orthodox call the philokalia, the love of beauty, the divine beauty, our relationship with each other.
Thank you, Alastair. Iain, do you want to come in on that? I've got a direct question for you as well.
Yeah, well, I would say, I think Coleridge said something like that the imagination is the repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am. So, it really saying the same thing, that it is the way in which God speaks. But you're right that it can be perverted, as all things in the human realm can be perverted. And I don't want to go there now because it would take us too long, but I would stand up for the idea that there is a drive which wishes to thwart and pervert, and that it's what is traditionally meant by evil. I think it is a real thing that has power in human doings, and people think I'm mad, but I defend myself on another day. But that's what I would say about it.
So, Iain, the follow-up question to that, and this is the last one I'll ask. My sense is that very few people will think you're mad, but some might find you coy, in the sense that we had a moment there. Well, we had a moment there where we were eliding between the paranormal and the sacred, and I understand with your scientific background and due caution about misinformation and being misunderstood and so on. I fully respect and understand that, to keep things grounded and real and yet open as well at the same time. And we've had this kind of conversation before, but it's intriguing for me that as we're talking about fairies and you're joking with Alastair about fairies, I think there must be some people in the audience who are like, what are they really saying there are fairies? And in second sight and premonition, are we actually, is it okay now in a public conversation for reputed people to entertain these possibilities? I'm just saying, is that indeed the case?
Well, fairies and second sight are perhaps not the same thing, and it depends exactly what you mean by fairies. Not as they're commonly imagined, but more messengers perhaps from another realm, such as angels are thought to be. Although I'm not conflating the two. I have to answer so quickly, I can't really make the niceties I want. But my view on second sight and the paranormal is exactly that of my hero Johnson. He ended up saying, I came away not entirely convinced, but willing to believe. He listened to the evidence. He was interested in the evidence. He asked more questions. He didn't dismiss it. He thought there's probably something here. I don't know quite what it is. And it's not coyness. It's, I think, a natural discrimination between types of issues about which one can be relatively certain and those that one can't.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. So listen,
can I just say, Jonathan,
of course.
There's a huge amount. I mean, that's just three I could reach just now. There's Ted Cowan, the late professor of Scottish history at Glasgow University, with Liz Ann Henderson and Scottish fairy belief.
Right.
In Scottish scholarship, this is taken very seriously because it is understood as being about ways of seeing into and talking about the imagination. It's like it's a symbolic way of speaking about things.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I appreciate both of you being both open about it and discerning and discriminating about it. We have some great questions. If it's better to hear from the person if possible, so I'm going to try this initially, and if it doesn't work out, I'll just read them out. But first of all, Catherine Lord, do you want to try and raise your hand, and if we can find you, we'll unmute you.
Hello.
Okay, let's have your question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm interested in how we educate children, and the implications of the seeing in whole ways and seeing with our imagination and what we do with our children in schools. And I'm just interested in how you feel maybe our education system might need to change. so that we don't stop us being able to see things in with our right hemisphere.
Well, naturally, I feel very strongly about that, and I've talked many times about how I think education in this country and in the West generally could be reformed. I think the loss of the humanities, the prevalence of only STEM subjects is disastrous. And I think that education is about awakening a mind that is seeking, not about sating a mind with information and then checking whether it can regurgitate it. I think teachers should be freed up to talk about, I mean, not go wild, but to talk about the things that really interest them. That was how I was educated, and it worked because the spark came to me, if you like. That was right hemisphere speaking to right hemisphere. So I think all those things really, in brief.
Thank you, Iain. Appreciate that.
I would come in at that. Here's Rudyard Kipling, Puck of Pook's Hill, just handed down to me by the Christmas tree fairy. And it's fascinating because what's going on in the first chapter of this book, and Kipling's mother was one of the MacDonald sisters, 4 sisters who had their family roots in Skye. What's going on there is that Puck appears when the children say by oak and thorn and ash or something like that. Puck appears. He's the last fairy in England, because he says the English have frightened the rest of us away. And he says, I too will go when the trees are all gone. What does he do to reconnect the children? But he reactivates their imagination. Okay, he starts telling them their history. It's a very rumbustious history, as you'd expect from a writer of the Empire. Not the kind of thing you'd read to children today, perhaps, but that is what's so fascinating. He starts telling stories. So in answer to the questioner's question, I would say the way you reactivate imagination in children is story, is beauty, is creativity.
Yes. I'd just like to say, though, that I'm certainly, I can't speak for Alastair, but I'm not saying that rigor, clarity, logic, and all these things are not important. They're under-taught, actually, these days. Children are indoctrinated rather than taught how to think on both sides of a question. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we need to get back into the curriculum, imagination, narrative, myth, poetry, music, drama, all the rest. Yes, history, our own history, above all, but history of other places too.
Thank you, Iain and Alastair, and thanks for the question, Catherine. Caroline Thompson, if you could please raise your hand and let yourself be known. We'll try and unmute you. And while you're getting ready, if Anne-Louise Walters can also do the same. But first of all, Caroline, if we can find you.
Hi. Thank you so much for answering my question. I'm a composer and I write music. And I always feel people appearing in my music who has recently died, or people who I'm very interested in while I'm writing. And since you are both like the the heart and ratio in philosophy and poetry, I was thinking maybe you could have a poetic discourse about how people who died influence my music and where the music comes from anyhow. So that's a bit broad.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know. It's a bit a complicated profession.
So yeah, either of you want to take it on?
Well, I'll kick off if you like. I mean, of course, immediately I thought of Elgar's Enigma Variations, which were pieces of music inspired by people, some of whom had recently died. But I don't think that's what you're talking about. I mean, I think that the question where these things come from is very interesting. But the answer seems to be that they do not certainly originate in our conscious mind. They come through us in some sense. How far away that thing originates, I don't know, from my consciousness, but it certainly comes through my unconscious mind, and I think it comes to all artists in that way, and it's probably something bigger than ourselves that we don't appreciate that is speaking to us in forms. So, I mean, that's really what I would briefly say.
Thank you.
I have a whole chapter
Alastair?
on creativity, by the way, in The Matter with Things, yeah.
Alastair?
Well, I know that when I'm writing, and I really start tripping out. It's like I don't cry easily, but a few tears will come to my eyes. And it's just like I'm immersed in something and I'm telling it as it is. Iain talked about the importance of truth. Truth with a capital T is so important because in the Greek, the Greek New Testament, the word truth, aletheia, also means reality. In the Sanskrit, the word truth, satya, Gandhi satyagraha, truthfulness, also, as Gandhi points out, means reality forth. So we're talking here about real creativity. We're not talking about narcissistic art, egotistic art. We're talking about real creativity. It's about being receptive to listening to cosmic truth and allowing that to come through in whatever our art, or in Iain's case with his book, is intellectual creativity. It is trying to give expression to, honoring that.
Thank you
There's
very
just
much.
a little shade of something that Jonathan and I mentioned. I'll just say this quickly, which was that sometimes there is also a slight dark side to this. My own experience of the daimon that works in me when it does is that it's pretty ruthless. It doesn't really care about my health or happiness.
Yeah. Ask my wife the same question. Yeah, I mean, Iain, and I was giving a talk in Benbecula, and an old woman came up afterwards and said to Varenne, my wife, "Are you his wife?" Varenne said, "Yes." And the old woman said, "He must be very hard to live with."
Surely not. Okay, Caroline, I'm just trying to get through a few more questions just to respect the audience. So Caroline, I think you're unmuted now if you want to ask your question.
Okay. Yeah. Your discussion of Cyanolas was about the place of longing, and it kind of made me remember the concept of thin places, and that idea that in those sacred places, spiritual places, you are very close, like a hairbreadth away from the divine. Do you have any comments on that? Am I getting close to what you were referring to?
Absolutely is what I'd say. So I don't mean to jump in ahead of you again, Alastair, but I mean, that is exactly what I mean. That's what people say when they come here. This is one of the thin places. It is. It absolutely is. And that other world is closer here. And no wonder, therefore, one can hear, feel, and see things that the noise of the city drowns out.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question from our old friend.
No. That fairy's got to go.
George MacLeod of the Iowa community. One of George's things was, George's big question was, what's the matter? And he said, matter is the matter. It is when we forget that the divine is incarnate in matter. That's when we have to ask what's the matter, because we've forgotten that incarnation.
You may have forgotten that I asked, what's the matter with things?
Yeah, just a good moment, Iain, just to briefly remind us that the meaning of your title, The Matter with Things, because that appears to be pertinent.
It's simply saying there's something going wrong that needs sorting out. What's the matter? And there's a lot of the matter is to do with our privileging of a kind of very debased idea of matter, devoid of any immanent spirit, simply lumpen matter. And our belief that the world is composed of things. It isn't. It's relational, and things secondarily emerge from a web of relations.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that quick answer. Rupert Reed, our old friend Rupert Reed, come and give us a question.
Rupert.
Good evening, both. So I wanted to pick up on Iain's remarks about how we are disconnected, estranged from truth in this civilization, and I wanted to suggest that while that's completely true, there's also a tendency which is opposite, maybe equal. That's what I'm kind of asking, which is of an enormous hunger for truth that you can sense here tonight in the audience, but also in the two of you. For me, one of the ways this has come through very strongly in recent years is in the absolute determination in the climate movement to break through in a new way by truth telling and not staying within the normal confines of of a sort of conservative risk analysis of where we are at. So if there's a question, the question would be, I'd love to invite you both to comment on, well, firstly, whether you agree, and secondly, if so, how do we enable this second tendency, the tendency of the love for the truth and the authentic, to overtake the first tendency, which Iain was so powerfully mentioning?
You go ahead, Alastair.
Rupert, I missed the very last bit because we're getting lots of captions coming up over my transcripts and I'm very deaf. I missed your very last point of your question. Could you just repeat it?
So the very last point was, how do we strengthen the tendency to long for the truth at the expense of the tendency to disconnect from it? Yeah.
You be truthful. You make an ethic of trying to be truthful. It's very difficult. We're in a culture where we are all expected to tell little white lies because they help to lubricate our relationships. Well, bugger that. That starts to distort. It's what it starts to distort things. It has a subtle distorting.
It's the whiskey speaking.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And with, I don't think any of us always succeed. But you really work at being truthful. You work on being honest. I had a dream last night about this. I had a nightmare last night. I woke up about 3 a.m. I was at the end of our house, the surgery in Lurbost. I was standing by the road, and it was dark. It was pitch black, and what we would call a poor Trahan, a poor soul, a very simple man in the village who used to wander from house to house, was standing there. And he pointed out across the moors, and he said to me, there's a madman raging out on the moor over there. And I went back into the house. I started locking all the doors for my father's medicines ware and all the rest of it. And there was a sense of this oppression, this fear coming in over me, and a sense of that the madman was out to get what my father, the doctor, represented, and the National Health Service. And then I woke up, and for a while I was lying in bed, spooked. But when I woke up this morning, it all fell into place, Iain, in terms of the questions you've been raising about the dark side of the creative. Because who was the madman out in the wilds? The madman was your right hemisphere. The madman was what the doctor's surgery and medicine and the NHS cannot control. And the dream was saying, don't forget the madman. That is madman is part of me.
Yes,
well, if you see it,
I get.
And the truth is facing that. The truth is acknowledging that.
Okay, Iain.
I get what you're saying there, but I don't want anyone who to run away with the idea that I think that the right hemisphere has anything to do with madness. The left hemisphere is much closer to that, or with just fairy nonsense, as it were. It's our truth-telling organ, actually, and I go into that at great length in the first part of the book. What I would say in our answer to you, Rupert, is that you don't have to teach a hungry person to love food. And people are starved of truth and they know it. And that's why there's a hunger for people to buy an incredibly long book, which aims to help them on a journey. And from the messages I get from people all over the world of all ages, they don't feel they've been let down on that. They feel they have been taken somewhere that has made a difference to how they think. So that's really what I'd say. I've just finished reading That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's quite a good book, really. And it really is about how when people see something desperate happening and destroying everything beautiful and imaginatively rich, they eventually, the falseness crumbles. And I hope that we'll live to see that happen.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. And thank you, Rupert, for the question. Just in the interest of time, Gary Hoover, I'm going to slightly paraphrase your question, which is a great question. In effect, Gary is arguing, and I've noticed the same thing, that many describe the modern world in terms of, an anthropogenic extinction event, that the world as we know it is ending, typically ecologically, but sometimes technologically. And this may or may not be an accurate scientific prognosis, but it's limited, sort of reductionistic and technical in its perception. There are other ways of framing this in terms of, I don't know, apocalypse, Armageddon, or something more imaginal, or this kind of thing. How would you see it, both sort of scientifically and more spiritually? How would you describe the state of the world and the predicament that we're in? And I'll go with Alastair first, please.
I don't think we're going to, as human beings, become extinct. Many other species are already becoming extinct because of our actions. I don't think we're going to become extinct as some people make out. I think the challenge of these times is to take in the suffering of the world that we are all participants in creating, and to use it as a wake-up call to building community and creating beauty, or being open to the creation of beauty through us. In my most recent book on climate change, Riders in the Storm, I've written 2 books on climate change, but the most recent one, the final 2 chapters, are about community land trusts in Scotland, because that is where on the ground I see beauty being recreated, both with nature and in human nature. And that is something we can all do. You know, whether we're in an urban context like I am here in governing Glasgow, or in the Hebrides, whatever, we can all work on our relationships with each other and on our relationships with nature, making beauty, making love. It's not rocket science. It's just about sharing, making a meal, cooking, sharing a book, having a chat like this tonight.
Thank you, Iain. How bad are things?
Well, I said, sorry.
I guess I'm also interested just your sense of how bad things are, like, you know, how the state of the world.
Well, I would say, first of all, amen to everything that Alastair said there. Those words could have come from my lips. I do think things are very bad. I think it's possible to use various techniques we have of soothing ourselves and thinking that it's probably not all that bad. And it may not be that bad, because prediction is an imprecise art. We usually are not entirely accurate in our predictions. And science and imagination need to be in dialogue. Science alone cannot really tell us what's wrong with the world we're in or where it's going next. Imagination has possibly more to say about that, but the facts that science can give us, when it can give us facts that we can rely on, which is not as often as people think, is very valuable. And you know, my whole epistemology, Alastair, in the second part of my book, is that we need to bring together science and reason with intuition and imagination, that none of these is dispensable, and we need to bring them all to bear. I think if we do, we see both that things are very bad, and in my view, that there is the possibility for something unforeseen to happen, which is a revolution in the human spirit. And that may sound all very well when we're facing these practical problems, but actually the practical problems won't be solved by simply practical solutions. They also need to be coupled to a renewal of a spiritual dimension to our lives. And I think that the signs that that is very much craved by the young and the old now, and that this is a sign of hope. And that also, just to say, because you said something like we can all play a part, this is hopeful for everyone, because people say, oh, what can I do? I'm so small, the world's so big. And by the way, our world is so small. Look at the size of the cosmos. That's got nothing to do with meaning. That is the left hemisphere's way of thinking, measuring. But actually, how big is love? How big is the divine? How big is the sacred? And they're all in here, and they can all begin from here, and you can unleash them, you can grow them. And that is what we can all begin that work tonight, not even tomorrow morning.
Oof.
Woo!
Yeah, I mean, if this was an auditorium, applause would break out at this point. Listen, thank you. We've reached our 101-minute mark, and I'm very grateful to you both. I'm grateful for the audience questions. I would encourage those who've enjoyed the chat during the Q&A to save it. There is a way of doing that whereby you look for the ... sign, the ellipsis, and click on that, and it usually lets you save the chat. That will give you access to any links that were given there. I'd also encourage you to search out Alastair's books, particularly the ones he mentioned, Riders on the Storm on Climate Change, I very much recommend, Poacher's Pilgrimage and Soil and Soul. for Iain, of course, The Matter with Things, particularly, highly recommended. And if you want to check out Perspectiva, we've also given our link to the website. Here we have a Substack, which you're welcome to join. And if you become a paid subscriber, there will be perks forthcoming for those who do so. Thank you very much.
The other thing you need is the email for the fairy on the top of Alastair's Christmas tree.
Right, yeah.
Who will find you all the books that you need at the very moment you need them.
Yeah, if you want the books at hand, we need to get that. I'll get that contact information for the Christmas tree fairy later, Alastair. But for now, I wish you all a thank you. And you can just briefly unmute to say bye. It's going to be a bit cacophonous, but let's enjoy the merriment for a second. If we can do that, guys. If not, then we'll just have to enjoy the silence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.